Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me. My name's Cindy Compert. I'm CTO for Data Security and Data Privacy in our IBM Security Division. We are a $2 billion startup within IBM, and we have really been focusing on the increasing sophistication of cyber threats. How do you deal with them in a changing world? And also, how do you manage privacy? So we're really focused on both these days. So my session's called Find, Map, Locate, Treasure, and Avoid Pirates. And it's really about a holistic approach to information risk and protection. I have always been fascinated with pirates. When I was a little girl, I lived in New York, and I remembered seeing a TV show about this Pirates of the Caribbean ride in Disney World. And I remember taking a 19-hour car ride down to Florida to go to Disney World. That was the most exciting thing of my young life. And I just remember that feeling of being in this completely different world. And, you know, the pirates got to have fun, and they got to get treasure and do all this stuff. And it was all very exciting. And I still, to this day, when I go on that ride, I sing along, Dead Man Tell No Tales, and I sing the song, and I enjoy it. But unfortunately, you know, the reality of today is times have changed, and pirates are now sitting behind computer screens, and they're well equipped with all kinds of tools. And as we know, things have radically changed, and every day they're changing even more. So what I'm going to cover today is talk about what are the industry trends that I'm seeing? And it's not just there's more and more attacks and et cetera. I'm going to talk about like the underlying themes and what I see developing in the industry. And then steps to protect your treasure, what are specific steps you can take, and then what's next, what's on the horizon. So we don't have a lot of time together, but I'm going to do my best to speed along and make sure that we can cover as much as possible. So first thing, today's security drivers. We know, first and foremost, advanced attacks. Although I will say this, the biggest attacks we've seen lately, they're not advanced. They're as basic can be. And it's so frustrating to me when I know that we can prevent those kinds of attacks. Yet there are some very sophisticated advanced attacks. There's a new one where, instead when you get a screen to go and it's a phishing attack and you fill out your information, most of what's there is an image, so most scanners can't really scan that to look for malware because it's an image. So there are a lot of things developing in how malware is placed and moved around that have changed a lot. Human error, clearly, vulnerabilities abound. The best you can do is hope to try and stay as current as possible. Innovation is really pushing us in new directions as far as how we protect things like Internet of Things devices, the fact that everybody is mobile, that such a large percentage of our constituents' activities with us are going to be mobile if they're not already, right? I should be able to get on an app and look at my property tax payment or apply for social services or even, contact the city or the county about a pothole that I saw on my street and, point at the location and someone comes out to fix it. Wouldn't that be nice? My street has a lot of potholes lately, so that's why I'm saying that. And by the way, I am a California resident. I live in Redondo Beach, a little down the coast, so, Great to be in my own backyard for once. Compliance is clearly continuing. If anything, it's accelerating. It's so interesting because California was the first state to have breach notification laws. We are so far ahead in terms of how we respond to and protect privacy. So I see that going on. Although I will say this, New York State recently enacted a set of cyber regulations for pardon my VPN, for critical infrastructure that mandate things like encryption and incident response. So, New York is definitely moving along. Less privacy, more critical infrastructure, but still important. And then skills gap. We just cannot find enough people. And in as much as we do things like we have university programs where we partner with the community, we also have a program to train veterans for what we call new-collar jobs. So we're trying to recruit folks to help fill those gaps, but again, it's about working smarter. So let's continue then. Now, one trend that is really hitting is what I call the big data tsunami. It's data everywhere. Data is now the foundation of everything we do, whether it's, my device, my Internet of Things, it's analytics, and look at how analytics has really come into security, cognitive, cloud, just having data everywhere. And the real challenge is it's a lot harder to control than it was back in the day when it was sitting behind the walls of a data center. We know that so much of what we do in our communities is sharing information, and that means it is more vulnerable. And so many of the attacks have been around third parties. So working with your, even your providers, your service providers, there needs to be a little bit, I think, more due diligence in how do you vet out a service provider, even a cloud provider. What are they doing to help protect your critical information? Now, here's something that's really interesting. So there's a group called Ponymon, and every year they do a cost of a breach study. And they talk about what are called churn rates. So what percentage of customers do I lose after a breach? And the numbers that they've been showing for years are somewhere between like 0 if you're the government, because we can't move, right, to just over 6%. So healthcare, life sciences, they tend to lose around 6% of their customers after a breach. Well, this study came out earlier this year by Accenture, and what they found is 1 in 4 consumers have had personal health information stolen. 1 in 4 of us in the room. I'm a 2-time victim. I was hit by my provider and my payer. I won't say who, but in the same year, I was subject to two healthcare breaches. Now, what's so interesting, 25% of those consumers who were hit by a health breach changed their healthcare provider as a result. That is a huge number. It's a huge number. So as we're working in the community, it's something to think about that, in government, you may not be changing your government, but it certainly affects elected officials, right? It affects, how the public views the government. So I think that's a very important statistics because it shows that consumers are they're very sensitive, and certainly the big breach 2 weeks ago, couldn't be more clear of the outcry and the amount of legislation that's being introduced to protect what we're starting to now think of as critical infrastructure, which is our very critical personal information. So let's see, we talked about a few of these trends. So securing critical data, dealing with third parties, new technologies, and then interoperability of IT systems. How do we glue systems together and then provide the relevant security around it? All of these activities and trends have led to security being now viewed as a strategic initiative. Several of the states that I work with, the governor is the executive sponsor and advocate for the cybersecurity program. I think of state of Illinois as a great example. Governor Rayner, he talks about cybersecurity all the time. The state has published their cybersecurity strategy. The whole thing is available. You can go review it, and then they regularly update the public on what it is they're doing. So I think that's that's an interesting data point. We've also seen a shift in maturity of how organizations are managing their implementations of security. So, we know we've gone from, very simple attacks to very targeted organized crime attacks. Ransomware, has a lot of folks running around with their hair on fire, especially in healthcare. So, there's a lot more concentrated, orchestrated attacks. We do see disgruntled insiders. Another shocking study that I saw was 1 out of 5 employees would sell their corporate credentials. 1 out of 5. 2 years ago, it was 1 out of 7. And 40% of them said they would sell them for a certain amount of money or less. Anyone want to take a guess what that would be? How much is a going rate for a credential? What do you think? Throw some numbers. I heard 1,000. 10 grand. 1,000. Less than 1,000. Several said $100 or less. So, if you're not happy, you didn't get a good performance evaluation, you didn't get a good raise, well, there's always that. So I think we need to think about insiders and then who has access to those critical crown jewels. Also innovation, we talked about that, that innovation is moving much faster, a lot of work around smarter cities, and then compliance is not just checking the box, but it's really thinking about what is the risk to the organization, and then what compliance applies. So, what is a security organization to do? Well, you can go buy tools, and we have lots of vendors out there, including ourselves, IBM, and you can buy different tools to do network forensics, malware, access management, privileged user management, you name it. But there's a problem here, folks. Most organizations have like 80 tools from 40 different vendors, and they don't work together. And then they have to spend all this money to glue them together, or because they're storing all this extra data, they have to buy more licenses, and then soon they can't afford it anymore. So that's really the biggest issue we see in security, aside from managing attacks, is how do you provide this cohesive view of how you protect critical information. So we came up with this idea of a security immune system, and this is kind of a high-level chart showing what it's about. And this is not like go buy a bunch of IBM products and you have a security immune system. Of course, that's great. We love when you buy our products. But this is really a strategy that says that effective security is like the human body. The human body fights off threats with what? The brain and the central nervous system and the immune system. So, I could get a cut, I break a bone, I get a cold. My immune system knows how to dispatch and coordinate that response to make me better. So the same thing is with effective security, where that brain or central nervous system is the security orchestration and analytics in the middle, and now even adding cognitive or artificial intelligence. So having that brain that coordinates all this threat information and figures out how it's related. So whether you start in endpoint, like laptop type security, mobile security, data security app, any one of these areas, these are all interconnected and they can share information. And a lot of the work that we've been doing is around that integration. So integrating information together so that I understand who is a friend, who is a foe. That user named Janet, who was a power user and she got promoted to a database administrator, she still had access to the HR system. Why is she on that system at 2 in the morning? Well, using something like behavioral analytics, I can see that her access patterns are different from what she usually does, and there's probably some kind of a threat going on. So that's really a good example. And if you want to see this in action, if you go to ibm.biz/puppy demo, I created a demo. It's a cloud-based environment where I demonstrate the security immune system, a live, real-time kind of hack with a phishing attack, and I show how this poor Janet gal got compromised and then how an immune system can help her. So again, that's ibm.biz/puppy demo. So definitely take a look. We don't have time to show it, otherwise I would take you through it. So those are the areas of the immune system. We built this out a little bit, and what you can see is depending on the security discipline that you're looking at, there are different subdisciplines within it. Today we're really going to focus on information risk and protection. And I believe these slides will be made available for download as well. So, as an example, let's talk about endpoint. So first you have endpoint detection and response. Is there malware that's been planted on my workstation or on my mobile device? Endpoint patching and management. So are my patches up to date? Maybe there's a vulnerability that lets someone get root access and we need to have that patched. And then things like malware protection, so having that continuing detection and response. So, each of these areas really provides that rich view of how do we identify and prevent threats. Now, depending on your organization, you may start at one or more of these areas. You may start at something really simple. I like to think of encryption as cheap and cheerful because, it's pretty straightforward to put in and it provides a basic level of protection. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So within a security immune system, there are two main areas. We're going to focus on information risk and protection, but I want to highlight security operations and response. This is what the presenters talked about at lunch. So that idea of having security operations center, detecting attacks, stopping unknown threats, responding quickly. That's when you see malware and you shut it down quickly. You're able to block malware and prevent attacks. Or in the case of WannaCry and Petya, you have that automated patching going on all the time so that when those attacks came in, the clients who were automatically patching all the time, they were not affected. Weren't affected because they already had taken care of that. Or, even maybe using application security, detecting vulnerabilities in your web applications is another example. So what I'm going to do in the remaining time we have is talk about information risk and protection. And this is an area, for whatever reason, it hasn't matured. It is very mature, but I think the awareness of what it is in the security realm is not as high. And I have a hypothesis around that. The security folks that I work with, for the most part, they came from two areas. They were either network administrators or system administrators. And some folks came through like pure security from day one, but that's probably like 10%. It really is. It's pretty low. But the challenge is when you grow up in that world, which is you're really network and OS focused, well, what about where the data is? What data controls do you have? So what I found the last 2 years especially, more folks from the DBA database world are moving into security. So we're starting to get a little more maturity in that area. And it's really around understanding data and understanding users, or an entity that looks like a user, and then identifying what is the risk everywhere from on the data center out to the digital enterprise, and then IoT and cloud. So these are some of the specific security areas that are involved in information risk and protection. Knowing your users. So how do you manage identities? Our friend Janet, when she got a promotion, she probably should have had her access to the HR system revoked, right? Because she no longer needs to have access. So that's identity governance. That's one of the areas here. Then we have privileged identity management. Shouldn't a system administrator check out a credential that's shared? Shouldn't that system administrator have a unique identifier? So if we have a shared credential, we know who that person is when they're doing work. In case something happens, we can trace back. So these are some of the areas where we see clients starting to implement a security immune system to help improve visibility into who is doing what and where on what systems and for what reason. So with that, I'm going to transition and talk about steps to protect your treasure. So, what is a risk-based approach to identifying and protecting your crown jewels? Now, crown jewels could be virtually anything. It could be sensitive financial information. It could be health information for medical benefits. It could be HR information. Let's say you have, personnel issues. Those are all considered crown jewels. So they're all things that we would want to protect. So we're going to talk through a series of steps of how do you get there. And not to say you don't take every one of these steps. You pick the ones that make the most sense for your organization. But the first and foremost is setting up your policies. And I mean your organization policies. What are your crown jewels and what's personal data? So each organization defines it a little bit differently. I start with personal data because that's the one that is getting the most attention right now. So when we talk about that, we think of virtually anything that identifies an individual. Could be that driver's license, social security number, it could be some personal information around how do you get your password back. First of all, I think that's the worst security you could ever have because anyone can look that stuff up on Facebook. It's simple. Go to classmates.com. You'll figure out the high school mascot, what year someone graduated, all that good stuff. So In the state of California, we have some pretty narrow definitions of what is considered personal information, but depending on the client I work with, they define it differently. So one of the utilities I work with, they have a pretty broad definition of that. Also, they deal with smart meters, so some of the information on the smart meters is really considered personal information, and there are separate regulations around that. But that's the first thing you want to do is get a list of what are those identifiers, what does your organization consider personal information, and beyond like a login ID, health information, etc. So that's why I have in red, your legal compliance and privacy organization will make that determination. So I have found security folks saying, well, we think it's not, this doesn't count, like IP address doesn't count. Well, IP address counts a lot if you're in Europe because it's now considered personal information. So, you do want to make that a policy decision. Step 2, create a good treasure map. So this is a real map. It is almost 500 years old. It was illustrated in 1539, and it's the earliest map of the Nordic countries that gives detail and place names. But it also has sea monsters all over and like very, very creatively drawn things in there. So the question about your map is, do you have a data map? Do you know where all that important data is stored? Is it full of lurking sea monsters because it's wildly out of date and it's kept in a spreadsheet? Or do you continue to update it on an ongoing basis? So the first thing is, policies, and then figure out how to put it in practice. How do you automate that process? How do you keep it up to date? Very frequently, clients who have more mature practices will use security and privacy by design, and that means that they, when they have a project that kicks off, they'll do a data protection impact assessment. What personal data is being handled? What sensitive data? What controls am I going to apply? Many governments already mandate that. In Canada, the Canadian government mandates that for projects. That's part of what they're required to do. Not in the U.S., but I expect that that's probably going to change over the next few years. Now, this is a leave behind. It's the getting started and the questions that you might want to ask as you gather your group together to decide where's that sensitive data, who owns it, how is it managed, what visibility do you have to who is accessing it. Some clients will use like a DLP tool like data loss prevention, and that's effective, but it only tells you what stuff is already going out the door. How about where's the data at the source? How do you know what it is and what's important about that? Also, how is it used? What is the risk? Do you have a risk assessment methodology in place? And then how do you prioritize what you're going after? I mean, think of it this way. If it's people, it's going to be anything related to, a resident or a constituent. It's going to be anything related to HR and probably partners that you work with, suppliers, et cetera, besides some of the critical infrastructure you maintain. We created a process around how do you do this, and we call that a critical data protection program. And it's a 5-step methodology, starting with defining those crown jewels and determining your objectives. So not everybody wants to be perfect, right? You may find that the level of risk you're willing to accept is okay based on your budget and your constraints. So you'll then want to automate and discover where that information is located and document it. Create a baseline of what you're doing today in terms of your controls, and then decide how are you going to remediate. What are you going to do to implement different controls, and plan, design, implement that, and finally monitor how well you're doing and ensure that you have protections in place and that you're measuring your progress. So, as I said, that's something we can help you do. Or, if you do it on your own, my best advice is think of it as a program, not a one-time project, that it needs to be sustainable. And, if you're on a budget, like doing a spreadsheet is a great first step. It's better than not having it documented. But make sure you lock that down, because if somebody gets their hands on that, then they have the keys to the kingdom. So how do you automate? There are lots of tools on the market. This is one of ours. It's called Guardium, and what it does is it has a set of classifiers that look at structured and unstructured information. For structured, it can look at the metadata, and it can also look at data patterns. And what it can do is take those patterns and you point it at data sources and can go give you a nice report, and then you can decide if you want to monitor activity against those data elements. So this one happens to be against structured data. There's also one with files, so I can go and look for a social security number or credit card number in a variety of files, and as a result, I may decide I want to do something else like encrypt. Step 3 is know your vulnerabilities. So because this is a sailing and a pirate-oriented session, I decided to include a sailing example. So anyone ever hear of leeway? We have a lot of leeway. Well, this is where it came from. So basically what happens is you, when a sailboat sails in the direction of the wind, it slips sideways between 8 and 20 degrees. And if you don't compensate for that side slip or leeway, you may end up off course, or you end up on Shipwreck Island. So the idea is, you have to know where you have vulnerabilities, be able to read a chart, or identify vulnerabilities, or they're really going to set you off course. And the most recent attack was, frankly, it was vulnerabilities and it was weak passwords, defaults. And my favorite saying is default equals disaster, right? Because default passwords are really bad. So vulnerabilities could mean a variety of things. In the security world, we think of vulnerabilities at the operating system level, maybe the network level, the device level, etc. But frequently we don't think about the data layer. So there's thousands of database vulnerabilities that allow you to gain access to an Oracle or SQL Server or DB2 database with a SQL injection attack, or by planting code inside what's called a stored procedure. So it's important to scan these data sources to understand what are the vulnerabilities so that you're able to mitigate those. And there's a set of industry standard tests. Some vendors have additional ones that are specific to the data source. We have one as well, and it's got something like 2,000 predefined tests. So my advice is don't do this yourself. Look at tools on the market to help you do this, and they can really help you lock down things like default passwords, passwords that never expire. People who know how to hack databases, they know all these vulnerabilities. They know the defaults. It's like what do they say? Fishing in a barrel. Like you're guaranteed to find something if it's an unpatched old system. So definitely recommend you take a look at vulnerabilities. Step 4 is identify information risk. So we talked about, finding your treasure, identifying and mitigating vulnerabilities, but then you want to identify the risk. So based on what's your most important data, where is that risk? And this is an example of an information risk dashboard that helps us identify the information assets and then the associated business areas and business processes, as well as in the upper right-hand corner, the actual data sources, where they're located, the number of vulnerabilities, and even the number of alerts against them. So it will tell me what are the risk levels based on those assets, how many rows I have, how much data I have, what area of the business am I in. So this is something to think about, is how do I get that macro view of my risks across the enterprise. Step 5 is implementing security controls to protect data. So, I mentioned this is all about data security, but data security is not just around, go encrypt everything. That's a great start, but it's who has access. So, are you managing, are you monitoring everything privileged users do? Are you doing things like recording their session activity so you can play it back? Are they checking out credentials? Are you managing mobile devices so that if a device is stolen, if you bring your own especially, that you wipe the device remotely, immediately? So I talked about some of the other data protection mechanisms. I'll talk a little more about encryption in a few minutes. Security intelligence is that central point, and that's where you basically take all the alerts from all the other places and you correlate them together, and that's where it can tell you where you might have a real threat. We have data and file activity monitoring, so that is the ability to look at the actual traffic against those data sources, and based on who is accessing the data, where they're coming from, what they're accessing, and what they're doing with it, you can create rules that will either create an audit trail, send out alerts to your security intelligence, or even potentially block or mask the information they get back. Like, why does a database administrator need to see social security numbers if they're doing some testing? It should be masked out so that they can't see it. We talked about application scanning. And then underneath here is program management. Got to have a program. You have to have stakeholders. You know, got to have executive sponsors. Without that, it's really hard to sustain this, this type of approach. And we don't want to forget cloud. That's step 6. So there's 2 ways of looking at cloud. Delivering security for the cloud. So how are, you know, in addition to your cloud provider, are you adding new security or consuming security from the cloud? So incident response is a good example. You know, we have for incident response automation, we have a SaaS offering. So you consume it from the cloud. You know, you don't have to install anything on premise. I do believe that a lot of the cloud providers are still getting mature in terms of how you integrate that information, the security information coming from the cloud to your operations. It's definitely an evolving area, and one to ask your cloud provider about is, how do you get visibility? How does, you know, how do your cloud alerts correlate into your security intelligence? What kind of audit trails do you get? A lot of the less mature cloud providers don't necessarily have that level of information. So, you know, it's something in your due diligence when you're talking to cloud vendors, you'll definitely want to ask them about, as well as, you know, what certifications do they have? You know, do they have ISO certifications, SOC 2 reports? Do they meet certain standards? Now, the data security specific controls are quite numerous, and you know, depending on where you are in your evolution, you may employ one or more of them. So no matter what, the discovery and classification is really ground zero, unless you just want to encrypt everything, and that's a good approach too. You could encrypt everything, but guess what? And there are now encryption solutions with low overhead. They don't require, you know, application changes. But what if someone has privileged credentials? The data's in the clear. So, you know, you do have to think about it as a big picture. So the discovery and classification is important, vulnerability assessment, the encryption we talked about, masking, redaction, the monitoring, so that ability to see who's sending requests up and what they're getting back. And then being able to dynamically block them. So a request comes up, Janet is trying to access sensitive data at 2 in the morning, because you could install different policies depending on time of day. And if you see those requests from a privileged user group, what are you going to do? You are going to block them immediately. So that is dynamic blocking. I would say clients who are typically more evolved and more mature will implement blocking, because you don't want to block people unnecessarily. You want to make sure you're blocking the bad traffic and letting the good traffic through. And then compliance auditing and automation is also very important. Okay, so a couple more things before we wrap up. Hiding the critical parts with invisible ink. So this is all about obfuscation, which in and of itself is a very, very wide field. So I want to share with you some ideas about the different kinds of obfuscation and when you might use them. So at the top of the screen, we have an original value that looks a lot like a credit card number, doesn't it? So the first type of obfuscation is called masking. And masking is desensitizing personal information so that it's unreadable from the original form, but the format and the referential integrity is maintained. This is used a lot in test systems. You know, how many of you have production data and test systems? You don't have to raise your hands, but we know that a lot of people do. So that is an approach to replace that data with fictitious but realistic looking data. Next is the redaction on the top right. That was the one where I mentioned how a system administrator or database administrator doesn't need to see live data if they do have live data access. That is when you mask out or asterisk out the leading information so that someone can't see it. We also have tokenization, and that is where you substitute a token that has it maps to the original value. The original value is kept somewhere else, and it can be reconstructed if you need it. Credit card security uses tokenization a lot. It does require application changes, so you don't want to do it where you have a lot of stuff to mask. But if you have one or two columns that you want to wipe out, then tokenization is a very good approach. Can have a lot of overhead, but it's certainly very effective. And then we have encryption, and that is when you encode data so that only authorized individuals can read it. They have a magic key that they use to decrypt it that makes it visible to them, and to everyone else it looks like garbage. So great example is you have your data stored in a SQL Server database, let's say, and someone gets access to the file system and they dump out the files. If the data is not encrypted, they'll be able to see data in the clear. That's not a good thing. Or let's say you have crash dumps. A lot of times crash dumps will have encrypted data or unencrypted data in the clear. So encryption is a way of scrambling all that information so only people who go in through the front door get access. And if you're really interested in this field of study, this is the most amazing chart. It is a visual guide to data de-identification, and it goes way, way, way beyond this. Talks about all the different kinds of masking methods, and I certainly encourage you to take a look at that. I find it a very useful guide. So cryptography. When we look at encryption and cryptography, it means different things to different people. It could mean protecting data at rest. So, you're encrypting tapes. So if someone steals a tape, they can't read it. You're encrypting disk, same idea. And then there's also access control-based encryption, so that, let's say, only someone who comes in as a database or file user can see that information. Otherwise, it is not usable. You, of course, have data in motion, which is network encryption, and data in use, and that could be things like, again, the tokenization that we talked about. So all of these work together. There's certainly some overlap. I would say overall, file system encryption isn't great because there's no separation of duties. Same with database encryption. You really want to separate the duties of someone who is administering it from a security administrator. The other thing is that if you have multiple environments, how do you support multiple operating systems from one single pane of glass? So, if your intention is to implement encryption as a strategy, there are solutions on the market that can help you with that. And then the last step, step 8, is track your progress. So how do you measure success? How do you measure progress? What does that mean to you? Every organization is different. It could be how many vulnerabilities you mitigated. It could be how many users you've stopped from getting access. It could be how many data sources you're monitoring. Could be all of those things. And here's an example. So this is a data security compliance dashboard. This is our Guardium product. And what you'll see is this is a dashboard for setting up monitoring, and it tells us how we're doing. We've got 24 databases we've discovered, 21 are unconfigured, and 3 are configured. And then it will tell me when I've scanned, if I have monitoring turned on, and also what monitoring policies I have in place. This one happens to be for some European privacy regulations. So and also PCI in the middle. So you can see, in this case, it's really an operational measurement. But remember that risk dashboard I showed you? That's another approach where you have more of a business view of your information assets and the risk and how you're mitigating the risk. So the last chart is, how do you get to the new era of security? And the first one I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to go in backwards order, is expertise and collaboration. So at the lunch keynote, the speakers talked about, collaborating and sharing threat information. That is absolutely huge. The more that we can share information together, the more we're able to leverage each other's expertise. So, that's certainly something I really encourage. We have a free platform called X-Force. So if you go out to X-Force Exchange, you can sign up for threat information, and, it gives you additional threat visibility. We have that integration in cloud, so the idea of building those bridges between all those security disciplines, that's something that we encourage you to think about. How do you gain that visibility? And that's something, certainly something we can help you with. And then the last but definitely not least is intelligence and cognitive. So this is the idea of, oh, I do not want to join your network. I'm so sorry. That is the idea of applying our artificial intelligence and AI to understand what is a real threat, where has it spread to, and how to mitigate it on your own environment. And that's something we've done a lot of work with. We've trained Watson in cybersecurity. So Watson spent quite a bit of time learning the language of security and learning how to understand and help mitigate threats. But Watson really is like the armchair expert who advises you as opposed to going and doing your job. So we do see a lot of quite a bit of a future for applying AI techniques to help us do a better job of identifying and responding to and resolving threats. So we are basically out of time. I wanted to share with you a couple of follow-up links. These are links to some articles and blogs I've written around data security best practices and also data privacy, and they contain a lot of these elements that we've talked about today. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'm happy to answer additional questions. Thank you. All right. And you're welcome to come on up if you don't want to ask them publicly. That's cool, too.
Here's a question we have.
Yeah.
I have a question. What do you think of using blockchain to protect sensitive data? Like, is it too much overkill or?
So thank you, Sushmita. Sushmita is with our Guardium lab here in San Jose, and she's been doing a lot of work on data protection. I think of blockchain as potentially a very effective way to control access to information. We're certainly starting to look at it for beyond financial transactions to things like securing one's identity and and helping control the information they have. I think it's going to come along in the next couple of years. The challenge is getting the industries to agree on what is that. You have to have enough partners who agree on this is the approach. But I think it could be very effective. There is one problem. It's right to be forgotten when you're dealing with privacy, and blockchain is immutable. How do you delete data that needs to be forgotten? There's techniques around preventing access or deleting keys and things. But I think there's some additional operational challenges with blockchain that we're still looking at. But certainly, I think down the road it's going to be a very good choice for a lot of reasons. But yes, thank you for answering the question.
So I got a question. You talked about Janet as an example. It doesn't work in all sectors, because if you're a small organization, that person who gave you a DBA that got the money, maybe the person does this. Right?
That is very true.
The other problem we face as a public agency, I don't know about the other agencies, but you've got the California Public Records Act. Right? If I, as Junkie Public, and you're an educational agency, it's not like you see your network infrastructure. I'll make a formal request, you have 10 days to respond. You can redact certain things, but then you're providing me certain pieces of information I can get, right? Because that's public information. Taxpayers are paying for that. So how do you fight that battle as well?
Wow. I have never been asked that question. That's fascinating. Yeah, I empathize with you on the, a lot of individuals have dual duty. It's got to work with your organization. I mean, certainly privileged user monitoring will help. Even if that individual does do multiple things, at least you're monitoring what they're doing and you have an audit trail. Trust but verify. It's not, not saying they're doing bad things. On public records, I would think, so some regulations will say things like, well, yes, you can provide this, but if it's not in, the public's interest because it's a security risk, I would think you would be able to make a court case.
We had that question come up because somebody wants the infrastructure of our office, and so we'll have to go legal.
Yeah.
Explain to them that they can have it, but I'm not going to list product or vendor or item.
No.
It's a one-to-one with legal in the room, so that I have some way to verify that he's coming in, we're sitting at the table with legal, it's all recorded that he wants this information for whatever purpose he deems necessary. He is the public.
Right.
Because they fill out a form to pay their dues, they can get it. Just like
Yeah.
emails. I want to see all your public records, all email correspondence. That's the base that the people are starting to ask now.
That's crazy. I'm seriously blown away. I would say legal challenge because, now, this is about public safety. This is about human lives. A few months ago, someone decided to take out the traffic lights in Dallas and, just to see that they could do it. But you think about doing that in the context of a terrorist attack, that's really scary. So if they know what your critical infrastructure looks like, it's super easy for them to create an attack just for you. So I think, as public sector, we need to be thinking about and anticipating, what are these kinds of threats to public safety? And, if it takes legal means, it takes legal means. If it takes lobbying for new legislation, then, we need to do that.
I think that's the key to legislation. because
I totally
all
agree.
agencies Follow what California legislation does.
Right, of course, yeah.
Unless it comes from legislation, we're just going to follow what we normally would do. So if you said you lived in Redondo Beach, so you have the right to go to your child's schoolhouse for their records, right? You're the parent. You can ask for a teacher's correspondence with another teacher because you heard something. That's the legislation that has to change it, legislation.
Right,
There's
yeah.
no compliance for education in terms of data security. There is for FERPA.
FERPA, I was going to say
That's it. That's
FERPA.
federal, but not
Yeah.
local.
Oh, right, yeah, yeah. And not easy. I think we're way further along than we were a few years ago. And, it's wonderful to have events like this. So, I encourage you, feel free to stay in touch with me. My email address is on there. I'm CC Big Data on Twitter. So, feel free to send me a note. And, always happy to talk to you and chat and kind of collaborate on ideas. So thanks again and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Take care.